Hello, everyone. My name is Alex Colvin, and I'm the Public Programs Curator here at the Alabama Department of Archives and History. And I'm excited to welcome you to this month's Food for Thought. This was the Food for Thought we had planned for yesterday, January 20th, but unfortunately there were some technical difficulties that prevented us from going live. So instead, we have luckily gotten our presenter, Dr. Rindfleisch, to join us here and record the program so that we can still make the presentation available to you. Before we begin, I have a few quick announcements. First, I would like to say that our 2022 Food for Thought is made possible with sponsorship and support of Mike Jenkins IV. And also, I'd like to go ahead and invite you back for next month's Food for Thought. Please join us on Thursday, February 17th, when Karen Gray Houston will present Stories from a Daughter of the Boycott. And that's going to be right here on our Facebook and YouTube channels. So it'll be another virtual presentation. Without further ado, I'd like to introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Bryan Rindfleisch. He specializes in early colonial American, Native American, and Atlantic world history. Rindfleisch is an associate professor of history at Marquette University and the author of George Galphin's Intimate Empire, Intercultural Family, Trade, and Colonialism in Early America, which is available for purchase in our online store, Alabama Original. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Rindfleisch. Welcome, Dr. Rindfleisch.
Thank you so much, Alex. And Alex was so kind to say technical difficulties when in fact it was my 1-year-old daughter, as I'm holding in her arms, pulling out all my cords and basically screwing everything up. But love her to death still. Thank you again, Alex, for having me and for being able to reschedule and do this. And I just want to thank all of you for sticking with us and allowing me still to speak to you of sorts. And with that, I'm going to jump right in. And I want to take us back to January of 1764. And there's a man by the name of George Galphin, and he waited anxiously at his Silver Bluff plantation, which you can see in the slide in front of you. And he was waiting for a woman, Rachel Dupree, to give birth to their daughter, Martha. But his attention was constantly being pulled elsewhere. He had just received a letter from his sister in Ireland, from Martha Crossley, who pleaded for her brother's assistance to basically pay her family's passage to South Carolina and join him with her family of 7 at Silver Bluff. Galphin consoled his sister and promised to do all in his power to see her family there safely. Galphin then penned 2 other letters to Ireland, one to another sister, Judith, and a cousin, Robert Pooler. Galphin instructed both of them to inform him if, quote, any masters of family think it proper to come over to me, end quote, here at Silver Bluff. This was part of his efforts to give poor families in Ulster another opportunity in North America. At the same time, Galphin labored feverishly to finish a petition to the Georgia Assembly for lands on the Ogeechee River, where he intended to build a store and a second plantation staffed by his traders, slaves, and other employees. Galvin then turned his attention to the logistics of sending his deerskins to Europe, which he loaded aboard the Union ship in Charleston and the ship Elizabeth in Savannah. After that, Galphin's cargo set sail for London, where his merchant partners, William Greenwood and William Higginson, awaited that merchandise. Galphin, in other words, had a lot going on in early 1764. But Galphin's work was violently interrupted when one of his traders rushed into his presence with ominous news. The Muscogee Indians had killed 14 peoples on the Long Cane settlement in South Carolina. And you can see that the graves are still there to this day, commemorating this event. This conflict, which you can see here on the map as well, produced such a panic in the colonies that the newspapers reported the out inhabitants are all flocking into the forts, many of them destined for Silver Bluff. Now, the news proved especially disheartening to Galphin himself because he had spent the better part of a year negotiating a treaty with the Muscogee and the Cherokee, which had brought an end to the 7 Years' War, or what we call the French and Indian War. After digesting the details, Galphin settled on horseback for Muscogee territories to get what information he could concerning the murders of the white people, thereby leaving his pregnant consort and his unfinished business behind. Since Galphin cultivated a well-known reputation as possessed of the most extensive trade, connections, and influence among the Indians, he thought it was a duty incumbent on me to do what he needed to do here. Galphin later reported to the Georgia Assembly, quote, I, knowing where some Indians were at a camp about 20 miles off, met 10 creeks with about 20 or 30 women and children on their way to Silver Bluff for corn. This was just off the creek path that you can see located here, which is the arterial linkage between the English colonies and Muscogee territories all the way down to the Gulf of Mexico. When Galphin questioned the Muscogee party about the violence, they said they were surprised and said it could not be any of their people without their knowing of it. Galphin and the Muscogee then agreed to jointly inquire into the matter, and they went to the nearby camp on the Buffalo Lick. Galphin entrusted this task to one of his family members, Danny McMurphy, and to Captain Alec, one of Galphin's principal contacts among the Muscogee. And before leaving, Galphin asked the Muscogee to tell his people at Silver Bluff when they arrived that I would be back in 3 days and I was going out to find who did the murders. Soon after, Galphin met with Tugolke, a Miko, or what was known as a headman of the lower Muscogee town of Coweta, who explained that as soon as I was acquainted in the woods who the persons were that had killed the white people, I came immediately to acquaint my friend Galphin of it. Those who knew Galphin understood that his familiarity with the Muscogee stemmed from his, quote, connections and influence by having long been amongst the Indians at Coweta, as well as his connection with one of their women of Indian family distinction by whom he fathered several children. And you can see here's the matrilineal kinship tree that I've recreated for this family, at least on the Muscogee side. So you can see toward the middle off the left is Galphin, his match with a woman by the name of Matane from Coweta, and the various peoples that he was associated with and connected to through kinship. Therefore, when Tugolke, who you can spot on the kinship tree to the lower right, he spoke to Galphin, this Creek Miko conversed with a man whom many of his people, including himself, had intimate ties to with their own. Tugolke asked Galphin then to acquaint imperial authorities in Savannah and Charleston about the violence and to emphasize how they were blameless in the affair. And true to his word, Galphin did this for his kinsman, Tugolke. And this when he transmitted a talk to John Stewart, the superintendent for Indian Affairs in the South, and James Wright, the governor of Georgia. He promised both of those individuals the use of his boats in case he should have any letters to send to the Muscogee, because there is always traders at my house that will go down. Stewart and Wright then transmitted Galphin's intelligence back to London to the Board of Trade, who waited nervously for further news. Therefore, in the wake of what became known as this Long Canes crisis, it was readily apparent that family members, imperial authorities, Muscogee peoples, transoceanic merchants, Irish immigrants, and the peoples of South Carolina and Georgia all placed their faith in one man to keep peace and trade going in the South, Galphin. He had immediately spread word throughout the British settlements that it was unsafe to be out until he heard further word from the Muscogee, which included his own Irish community of Queensborough, which I'll get to later on. Galphin also wrote to his family and friends in Ireland to make them aware of the situation and instructed them to calm any fears among any intending leaving families from Ulster who awaited passage to his Queensborough settlement. Galphin then invited the Muscogee to meet with him at Silver Bluff, and in a matter of days he reported that 40 men, women, and children were here, and I expect a great more down. At the same time, Galphin wrote to his merchant partners across the Atlantic Ocean that with the fresh murders and insults would make a great abatement in our export of skins, that there was nothing to be concerned about, and he would see matters through. To alleviate their concerns, he even sent the traders to look after the goods in Muscogee territories and informed the Mikos that I could not think of sending any more goods till I heard what the headmen had concluded upon amid the violence. As a sign of good faith, the Muscogee left their presence at Silver Bluff, and Galphin confided to imperial officials that he thought the murders were not done by the Muscogee and thinks the Cherokees actually had a hand in it instead. As the commander of British forces in North America, Thomas Gage, responded to Galphin, he hoped that the storm that threatened the southern colonies will soon blow over, and in fact, it did. The entire reason that peace and trade reigned and that bloodshed had been averted, or more bloodshed had been averted, was because of Galphin. Now, while the Long Canes crisis demonstrated the deft negotiations that made Galphin's name synonymous with Creek-British relations in the South during the 18th century, it was not a role he was born into. Galphin came from very humble beginnings as the eldest son of a poor linen-weaving family in Ulster, or Northern Ireland. And you can see this is one of his letters. His letters are authored and penned just like this. He didn't leave any letters behind, but what he did, they are really incredibly frustrating to read. My wife is a fourth grade teacher, and she says basically he spells, and his punctuation is at a fourth grade reading level. That shows that he did not have education when he was a child, right? And this is a testament to his poverty circumstances as a child. Now, as a child and a young adult, he toiled in his family's flaxseed fields and wove linen until the death of his father in 1735, which then incited him to seek his family's fortunes in North America in 1737, when he sailed to South Carolina and never returned to Ireland. Now, over the course of 3 decades, Galphin reinvented himself as a trader and merchant in the deerskin trade. Galphin eventually established himself as a reputable and dependable intermediary then for Muscogee and English peoples, which only added to his political and commercial importance. Ultimately, Galphin's influence in the deerskin trade attracted imperial agents and colonial administrators, Muscogee Micos and other native leaders in the South, European merchants, and the legion of dependents that I'll talk about later on, who all gravitated towards Silver Bluff in search of some kind of relationship with this one man. For when it came to intercultural relations and trade in the South, nothing occurred without Galphin having a hand in it or knowing about it. And even with the onset of the American Revolution, Galphin remained a substantial figure. He was appointed by the governments in Georgia, South Carolina, and the Continental Congress as their superintendent for Indian affairs in the South. This is to say that Galphin was someone of importance to the many peoples, places, and events that transpired in the 18th century. Yet Galphin's significance as a go-between, a transoceanic intermediary, and a man of empire had little to do with his force of personality or his fortunate or circumstances, but it all revolved around the multitude of relationships that he forged with the many peoples of early America. As demonstrated in the Long Canes Crisis, Galphin utilized his connections with peoples who lived worlds apart. The Muscogee, Anglo traders, imperial agents, English settlers, Irish kinsmen, European merchants, Ulster immigrants, and so on. He used these relationships and peoples to navigate the violence and restore equilibrium to the world. Despite Muscogee hostility, familial and imperial anxieties, settler and immigrant fears, and merchant panic that threatened to ruin lives and fortunes in the South, Galphin deployed his relationships with different peoples in different places and with different interests and forced these peoples to compromise with one another. Therefore, the countless men and women who considered Galphin a relative, a friend, partner, ally, patron, employer, or master were linked to and even dependent on each other, and oftentimes in very surprising and unexpected ways. Galphin was thereby the heart and soul of a world of relationships that spanned early America, as demonstrated by these two slides. This was his relationships or his connections to all of these different places and the peoples of the places in the native South. The Muscogee, the Chickasaw, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Seminole, and the Le Petit Nations. And then if you look the other way to the eastward, these were all his relationships and connections to the places and peoples and places of the Atlantic Basin. He was a broker of interpersonal connections who knit peoples together despite the oceanic and cultural barriers between them. Through the connections that he forged over a lifetime with disparate peoples in far-flung places, Galphin accumulated social, political, and commercial capital that he used to carve out his own little niche in the South, which is why I title my book George Galphin's Intimate Empire. He proved himself able to mediate between European and indigenous worlds, and in times of conflict, bring those worlds back from the brink of disaster. Galphin's worlds of relationships encompassed the English colonies in America and the West Indies, extended throughout the British Empire around the globe, the native South, French Louisiana, Spanish Cuba, as well as transoceanic trade. So from the Muscogee town of Coweta to the ports of Cadiz and Senegal, Galphin utilized his personal connections to organize the world around them, to understand and move about the world. Galphin's world of relationships, then, reflects the intrinsic nature of empire itself in early America. At a fundamental level, the process of empire building in North America was always incomplete and a fraught process, particularly on the southern periphery where Britain contended with powerful nations like the Muscogee and the Cherokee, as well as the Spanish in Florida and the French in Louisiana. The British Empire then constantly had to negotiate the messy politics of the South. Yet it was not imperial administrators, colonial governors, or their agents who navigated this contentious terrain, but it was people like Galphin, who wielded their relationships with indigenous peoples to balance both indigenous and imperial interests in the South. Sometimes we call these individuals go-betweens, who are critical to maintaining peace and trade, but they utilize their connections and relationships to resolve differences and facilitate commerce. Nonetheless, the functions of empire and intercultural alliances were predicated on the relationships that flowed through these individuals rather than centering upon the connections between one person and another. In other words, it was less about the relationship between Galphin and Togolki, let's say, but the larger cast of characters who worked through these two individuals to ensure a harmony of dissimilar interests in the South. As demonstrated throughout the Long Canes Crisis, Togolki brought to bear his connections within the Muscogee world, while Galphin deployed his relationships with family members in North America and Ulster, imperial agents across the sea and in North America, European merchants and transoceanic trade, and many other faceless individuals who were swept up in these efforts to return peace to the South. In this and other instances like it, relationships were critical to the operation and negotiation of empire. Galphin provides more than just a mirror of empire and its periphery, though, for he personified what it meant to be a subject of empire in the 18th century. Now, Galphin's early life in Ulster, Northern Ireland, was defined by its poverty and marginality. That was a product of a centuries-long British colonialism in Ireland. And despite this fact, Galphin learned early on that one's relationships, and in this case with family, friends, and neighbors, was the means to cope with such conditions. And you can see that I've tracked his relationships throughout many of the northern provinces in Ulster. Now, Galphin replicated this process of forging connections with the various peoples he encountered throughout his life as he moved about the empire. Galphin reveals to us then the lived realities of empire in the 18th century, as individuals navigated the world around them through their relationships with others. In a sense, relationships provided structural foundation for the empire that individuals like Galphin inhabited, which allowed them to physically and mentally process that imperial world and their place within the empire. What all of this amounts to is the fact that Galphin carved out a world of relationships within the imperial infrastructure. Again, an intimate empire of his own. Now, at the most basic level, Galphin's intimate empire hinged upon expansive definitions of what constituted a family. His world revolved around his immediate and extended kinsmen in Ulster and North America, who proved vital to his trade and merchant operations and his efforts to attract Ulster immigrants to the south. Galphin's family also mirrored the intercultural dimensions of empire, as he sustained relationships with European, African, and indigenous women, all of whom he fathered children with, which we'll get into later. Yet the familial nature of Galphin's world went deeper than this, as he developed extensive kinship ties with the Muscogee through his union with Matone, the daughter of Coweta's Tustanogi Miko Chigeli. These relatives not only folded Galphin into a Muscogee family, but more importantly, a matrilineage. Galphin's conceptions of family then included Creek reckonings of matrilineal kinship. And what I mean by that is that every individual that you see depicted here and is shaded in, he was connected to each of them and then their families. And so it's a very expansive definition of what constituted a family, far beyond our nuclear households. But he also considered family to be more than just the four walls of a home or the nuclear family or the Muscogee matrilineage, but it also included his friends and dependents who were part of his household. Galphin embraced those individuals he called his well-beloved friends in the colonies in Europe also as family, like these individuals here, to the left being Henry Lawrence, a South Carolina merchant who was also a revolutionary. And he at times devoted more energy and resources to these individuals than his own family. Moreover, Galphin rhetorically invited his partners, his allies, and others into his proverbial household, creating the basis for a relationship by likening one another to members of his own household and same family. All of this is to demonstrate the critical importance and multifaceted meanings of family to the peoples of early America. Now, while critically important, family was only one set of relationships within Galphin's intimate empire. As a trader in the deerskin trade, Galphin forged connections with English, Scottish, Irish, French, Spanish, and Swiss merchants in Europe and North America, as listed here, all of these various individuals. He cultivated connections with the agents who carried out also the empire's negotiations with indigenous peoples, which included colonial governors, superintendents, imperial administrators, and their proxies, along with the various Mikos and townsmen of the native South, be it the Muskogee, the Cherokee, Chickasaw, Choctaw, and Catawba. Galphin pooled all of these relationships into an aggregate whole or a network to support his family's interests, again represented here. And as we saw in the Long Canes crisis, the relationships of Galphin's network intersected intimately with each other, as he used his connections with Muskogee Mikos, European merchants, and imperial agents to create peace and trade in 1764. In doing all of this, he lived up to his reputation as an eminent trader with a thorough acquaintance with the North American Indians from long application and services in the dangerous sphere of an Indian life. Or, according to Muskogee Mikos like the Tallahassee King and the Coweta King, they thanked Galphin, who always supplied and took care of my people and me. One might even argue that Galphin's relationships reflected the very networked nature of empire itself. Altogether, Galphin fused his non-familiar relationships into a network that not only provided a foundation to his world, but helped support his most intimate relationships of family. Now, Galphin also forged relationships with a series of dependent groups that included his European tenants, employees, and laborers in the deerskin trade, African and indigenous slaves who populated his Silver Bluff plantation. And you can see here several of the slave markers that still exist to this day. And the map on the right shows the various outlays of the various burials that have been found. But it also included Ulster immigrants who relocated the settlements that he established in Georgia, as well as the Muskogee townsmen who traded their deerskins to Galphin at his stores. These individuals and groups gravitated toward Galphin because of his resources, his connections, and his reputation that promised them either employment, maybe a roof over their heads, goods and necessaries, and a semblance of community and maybe safety. By turning to Galvin, though, dependents quickly discovered that their relationships with him were quite one-sided, as he exerted a measure of leverage or control over these people's lives, be it debts, rents, employment, or enslavement. Moreover, these dependents proved critical to Galvin's own aspirations for his family to climb the ranks of the empire's hierarchy. By exercising his prerogative or demonstrating his mastery over these dependents, Galvin utilized these relationships as a substitute for aristocratic birth or genteel refinement to justify his family's entrance into elite circles. These dependencies allow Galvin to claim his status as what he called a gentleman, distinguished by the peculiar excellency of his character and capable of the least degree of baseness. Now, particularly to the Ulster immigrants that Galvin sponsored in North America between 1768 and 1776, hundreds of families established the town of Queensboro in western Georgia. As you can see on this map here, it's circled in red. Now, undoubtedly influenced by his childhood experiences in Ulster, Galvin's life came full circle when he built a haven for Irish families who endured the same debilitating poverty as his own. As these immigrants described their circumstances in Ulster, they were chiefly farmers, greatly oppressed by the rents exacted at which they are obliged to hold their lands, as also by taxes and other duties in Ireland, so that their most exerted industry scarcely affords a comfortable subsistence. And they, having no hopes to obtain better terms by renewal of their leases, are determined to seek relief by moving themselves to one of His Majesty's American provinces. Now, naturally, Galvin's desires to do good for these families intersected with his own ambitions to build an entire town beholden to his patronage. It is no accident that the Irish township was situated next to Galvin's plantation, the second one, at Old Town, alongside the banks of a river that flowed past Silver Bluff, in close proximity to the creek path, and at a great distance from colonial centers like Charleston, Augusta, or Savannah. Now, many of these Ulster families felt a profound sense of gratitude toward Galvin. He plucked them out of Ireland, promised them opportunity to accumulate their own land free of a landlord's control, and provided with the means to reinvent themselves, which reinforced a sense of obligation to Galvin. A number of these immigrants also believed themselves indebted to Galvin for subsidizing their voyages to North America, because Galvin was willing to send a ship to the various Irish ports for free. And he also promoted that each master of family would receive 100 acres of land, and that every family member in addition would receive an additional 50 acres. In addition, he also provided them farm tools, milk cows, and forgave their debts if they incurred any along the passage. However, with that, many of these immigrants could not rely on farming alone to support their families, and they had to seek employment in Galvin's firm, accumulating the same debts as the traders and other laborers at Silver Bluff. And to make matters worse, these Ulster tenants were often forced to shop at Galvin's stores for goods, and they could not produce themselves due to the distance between their township and the colonial centers to the east. So consequently, the Irish were ensnared in a cycle of debt that trapped Galvin's other communities as well. So take, for instance, one of these Ulster immigrants, David Irwin, who amassed a debt of £140, which is a hefty sum for someone of limited financial means and newly arrived. Such financial obligation often lived on after death, as was the case for Jacob Braziel or John Roberts, who had to appoint Galvin, being the chief creditor, as the administrator of their estates. And even the wealthiest families of Queensborough, like the Hardings and the Clements, owed hundreds of pounds sterling to the Galvin family. In short, Queensborough tenants were beholden to Galvin in more ways than one, and as the number of immigrant families increased in the late 1760s and early 1770s, Galvin continued to cultivate those dependencies. Now, this is where Galvin's dependent relationships illustrate yet another facet of empire in his own intimate empire, and that is patriarchy. In early modern Western societies, male power was privileged, whether in their relationships with other men, but particularly with women and those they perceived as inferior, be it slave, servant, indigenous, and so on. In fact, some scholars argue that the very imperial infrastructure was predicated upon what is called patrimonial power, in which the patriarchs of elite families were key to the organization of power within empires. In these ways and more, patriarchy and power were central to how Europeans understood the world as well as their relationships with others, and Galvin proved no exception to this rule. He meticulously crafted a paternalistic persona in his relationships, again, with the Queensborough Irish. He referred to the Ulster residents as my people and as part of his household. And it is no coincidence that Galvin, in his various advertisements to Ireland, appealed directly to the masters of families, deploying mutual understandings of what constituted patriarchy with these Irish immigrants, and framing himself as a master of the Queensborough community. In Galphin's mind, these Ulster dependents were much a part of his patriarchal world as his other traders, tenants, laborers, slaves, and families at Silver Bluff. Now, Galphin's patriarchy thereby demonstrates the gendered contours of his intimate empire. He was the dominant partner in a series of heterosexual relationships, as demonstrated here in his last will and testament, as he married his first wife, Catherine Saunderson, in Ireland and then abandoned her. He then married in South Carolina a sickly Bridget Shaw who died shortly thereafter, and was followed by a third marriage to a French woman, Rachel Dupree, which we met in the opening in January 1764. This was in addition to several exploitive relationships that Galvin had with African and indigenous slaves that included Nidahaki, Sappho, and Rose. The only force that seriously challenged Galphin's patriarchy was his Muscogee partner Matane, because of the matrilineal structures of Muscogee society. And if Galphin ever alienated Matane or her family members, he risked his entire trading venture. So he could not do that. He had to play by their rules. Now, along with this, Galphin's patriarchy was also conditioned by race, as Galphin bought, sold, and owned over 200 human beings in his lifetime. Like other slave masters in the 18th century, Galphin framed himself, though, as a paternalistic patriarch to his slave community, or what we call paternalism. And he routinely extracted the labor of his enslaved community and coerced their obedience via violence to assert his patriarchal control. Now, when distinctions of gender and race intersected, as they did for Nidahaki, Sappho, and Rose, the results were always disastrous. However, Galphin balanced violence with a paternalism that earned him a reputation with some of his slaves, like David George, as a great man, very kind, and an indulgent master. Such considerations were likely based on his toleration for slave marriages and families at Silver Bluff, his permission to build the first African Baptist church in North America at Silver Bluff, and a limited trust that he invested in certain slaves. But without a doubt, such actions could never offset the exploitive and violent nature of Galphin's patriarchy. Now, the patriarchal structures of Galphin's world obviously bred violence and conflict as much as they did affection and familiarity. Like any other slave master, Galphin relied on fear and terrorism, corporal punishment, and invasive surveillance to enforce obedience. But violence could take other forms as well. Galphin and landed elites in the South cultivated a cycle of debt with their employees, their traders, their laborers, their tenants, and immigrants, thereby creating extensive obligations to one man forever. Take, for instance, Bryan Kelly, who died in 1766 and left his family with an insurmountable debt to Galphin. The Kelly family was forced to transfer, quote, all and every the residual and remainder of my whole estate, real and personal, to Galphin, end quote. The same was at times also true for the Muscogee families who frequented Silver Bluff for the goods that they returned with to their communities, as the value of deerskins never matched the prices that Galvin charged at his stores. Such violence manifested most visibly during the Treaty of Augusta in 1773, you can see signed here, when the Muscogee ceded millions of valuable acreage to pay off their debts, much of which they owed to Galphin. But to temper such potential for violence and conflict, though, Galphin at times amended or softened his patriarchy and its relationships. Galphin used fictive kinship, or inclusive notions of what constituted a family and household, to moderate these relationships. Galphin positioned himself as the penultimate father, or head of household, and it is no coincidence that Galphin's contemporaries referred to Silver Bluff as his hospitable castle from which he presided over his people, this being the Anglo-Irish and African families who inhabited or surrounded Silver Bluff. In Galphin's mind, he enfolded these dependents into his proverbial household in exchange for their labors. In return for work and obedience, and in part to live up to his paternalistic responsibilities, Galvin dispensed patronage and favor as a father-like figure to his dependents. For instance, debtors like Stephen Forrester remained forever unable to pay off their debts to Galvin, but instead of taking his pound of flesh, Galvin permitted Forrester to live at Silver Bluff, and even sponsored Forrester's petitions for land in Georgia. Now, Galvin's paternalism allowed these dependents to at times circumvent his patriarchy, and further illustrates the symbiotic nature of Galvin's relationships of his intimate empire. Despite his best efforts, Galvin could not ignore the fact that his deerskin trade firm hinged on the labors of those he presumed to wield power over. Galvin was forced, then, to concede a measure of agency or negotiation to all of these others, unless he gambled losing those connections. Therefore, dependent communities lobbied Galvin to build churches, schools, and other infrastructure, to provide financial resources or to forgive debts, and other forms of patronage, such as the Silver Bluff Baptist Church, which you see depicted here. Galvin, then, as the benevolent patriarch, often acceded to such demands, dispensing his favor in return for obedience. Even the most exploited in Galvin's world, slave women like Nidahaki, Sappho, and Rose, still exerted a form of agency in their connections with him, given that Galphin manumitted all of the children born by these three women, as you can see here as well. Galphin's intimate empire then was constantly negotiated, and even by those who seemed to be the most dependent. Finally, Galphin's intimate empire was just that, an empire within an empire. Galphin spent his entire life in colonial environs, which conditioned his incessant drive to forge relationships to navigate the imperial world. Yet when he immigrated to South Carolina, that world looked markedly different from the one in Ulster. On the empire's southern periphery in North America, Galphin experienced firsthand how imperial power was again fragile, as dominant indigenous groups and European rivals prevented the advance of imperial interests in the South. If you've ever wondered why the reason that the English colonies never expanded to Florida is because you had the Muscogee there who blocked the English colonies from ever getting into Florida. Thankfully, the Spanish were happy for that. At the same time, though, he witnessed the creative power of relationships to shape the imperial periphery, in which his connections with family and friends, his relationships in the native South, transoceanic trade, and the empire, and even his dependent connections, could redirect and at times dictate imperial interests. It is hardly a coincidence that Galphin emerged as one who was, quote, so well versed in Indian affairs he was constantly employed to transact business with the Muscogee, end quote, or the fact that he could bring peace and trade back to the South in 1764 during the Long Caves Crisis. In other words, he used his relationships to shape imperial power in his own ways in the South. Thus, in addition, Galphin's intimate empire acted at times as a colonizing force in early America. Far be it from an impersonal process, the colonization of North America unfolded primarily at an intimate level between European and native peoples who interacted with each other on a daily basis. Galphin's relationships thus proved critical to facilitating and perpetuating empire in the South. For instance, he manipulated Mitanni's kinship ties to engineer the Treaty of Augusta of 1773 that expanded imperial power in the South, and at the same time carved out 88,000 of acres from his family relatives for himself. As one European ally put it best, Galphin has it more in his power than any person I know to induce the Muscogee to consent to the treaty, and they did. Galphin also financed the immigration of Ulster families to those lands ceded by the Muscogee, who then encroached on other Muscogee territories and sparked violence that threatened war with the British in the 1760s and 1770s. Further, Galphin and his commercial partners conspired to expand the traffic in deerskins, which translated into Muscogee debts that paved the way for even more treaties of dispossession. As these and other instances reveal them, colonialism operated at the most intimate level, in which an individual's everyday relationships abetted the process of empire building in early America. Despite the colonizing contours of Galphin's intimate empire, though, because imperial power remained so piecemeal and contested, empire building was a relatively or thoroughly negotiated affair with indigenous peoples, who always held the same bargaining power as the British. As one of the empire's preeminent proxies in the native South, imperial officials expected Galphin to advance imperial interests over that of indigenous groups like the Muscogee. Yet Galphin's world, first and foremost, hinged upon those Muscogee family connections, particularly with his wife's relatives of Coweta. The entire reason imperial agents and merchants gravitated toward Galphin in the first place was because of those Muscogee connections. And without the support of the Creeks, like you see here, or the Muscogee, particularly the members of Mitanni's family, Galphin's trade firm and the empire's relations with the Muscogee would deteriorate. Now, due to such dependency, Galphin was forced to balance the interests of Mitanni's family and Coweta and the Muscogee with that of the British Empire. Therefore, Galphin not only served as an imperial intermediary in the South, but as a Muscogee representative to the empire. And even though Galphin and Mitanni's families demanded different things and asserted dissimilar interests in their relations with each other, they shared mutual obligations to each other. Galphin and Mitanni's relatives thus established a relational reciprocity in which they offered one another a means to their own ends while abiding by their expectations to one another. In the minds of Mitanni's family, their relationships with Galphin offered an alternative source of leverage with the British and allowed them to shape the onset of empire and trade in the South. In short, the fate of the British Empire hinged on Galphin's relationships with the Muscogee, which illustrates, again, the negotiated and contested dimensions of empire building in the 18th century. Galphin's intimate empire, then, was thereby remarkably complex and intricate, to say the least. His world of relationships reflected his efforts to scaffold the British Empire in his own life, which consisted of the indigenous European and African peoples he continuously interacted with as he moved about the empire. Galphin's world was also intensely familial, as his relationships and ambitions for the future all revolved around his immediate and extended kinsmen. Galphin's intimate empire was also comprised of the interpersonal network that he cultivated in the native South, the British Empire, and throughout transoceanic trade that all intersected as part of the deerskin trade. Galphin's world, moreover, mirrored the patriarchal structures of early modern Western societies, by which he cultivated the dependencies of individuals, families, and whole communities. Such dependencies were governed by gender and racial differences and produced conflict and violence at the same time as negotiation and compromise. Finally, Galphin's intimate empire played a fundamental role in the imperial project and the colonization of North America. Yet the intimate dimensions of empire building always remained haphazard at best, a product of the continuous negotiations between these individuals of the British Empire and the indigenous South. In such ways, Galphin's intimate empire reflected the multifaceted and imperial realities of early America. And with that, that brings my talk to a close. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That was very wonderful. Worth the wait to have it recorded today. It was amazing. And unfortunately to our audience, since it's a pre-recorded presentation, we cannot take live questions from you. But if you would like to ask Dr. Rindfleisch a question, you can of course go to our Facebook page, put it in the comments, and we will try to send it to him. Or you can always contact me and I can connect you with him so that you can ask your questions. But I have a few of my own if you are able to stay on with us for a little bit longer. The first
Absolutely.
is, of course, every historian has that moment where they're going through and they're trying to find, that one source that helps them. And I know particularly with early America, it can sometimes get even harder because the sources are so scarce, and especially dealing with Native America, it can get even harder. So my question for you is, was there a source or a moment where you found something that just helped everything else click and kind of you felt like was the smoking gun of your research?
Yeah, that's an awesome question, Alex. You phrased it really well. I will say, in terms of there's enough questions on the Facebook page or sent to you, Alex, if we need to do another pre-recorded Q&A session, I would be more than happy to do that.
Oh,
in terms of answering your question, though, yes, I did. I didn't expect it because sitting in the archives, 9 to 5, if not longer, over the course of years, you kind of just it gets really old. And anyways, yes. For the longest time, genealogists and historians who have been attracted to the Galphin family have wondered where exactly they came from in Ireland because they've never been able to pinpoint that down. And so they've inquired over in Belfast, they've inquired with the Irish archives and tried to figure it out, and they've never been able to do that. So I tried to do that myself. And so in a summer between teaching, I actually went up to the Northern Ireland Public Records Office, or PRONI, and I basically dived into the rent rolls of the 18th century. And rent rolls are just a list of names, and they have hundreds of thousands of these rent rolls. And so literally I just poured over days just trying to track down the Galphin family. And after I guys swear about 10,000 different pages of these rent rolls, I finally came upon it, and I found the Galphin family. And I specifically found not just the Galphin family, but I found Galphin's father, Thomas Galphin. And he was listed as having a plot in County Tullymore, which was right next to several plots that were owned by other family members who I suspected were family members but didn't know. And once I had them all together, it was official. I was like, I got the connection. And to top it off, the chief sort of tenant, as they called it, the person who sort of presided over the community on behalf of the landlord, was a Pooler. And I mentioned the Pooler family earlier, who were cousins of the Galphin family. So there was sort of that smoking gun moment for me. And so I've finally been able to settle that answer for historians and genealogists who have wondered for that for the past century.
So that was this moment where you were able to kind of finally place him, know where he comes from, but also kind of that opens up this whole other avenue for you understanding him as this historical character of where he's coming from in Ireland.
Yeah.
And so coming in. So another question that is, we have a lot of patrons here who are genealogists and are always trying to piece things together. You also did this wonderful job of piecing together both his Native American family with Matane, but also you were able to find some pieces of his enslaved children.
Yeah.
Where were the sources? Were you able to find a lot of, how was it like piecing that together, trying to get their names, have their names be heard, but also beyond that will that we had, are there any other instances where they show up in sources, or was that the main source that you had for rediscovering these people?
Yeah, the George Galphin will I recommend for anybody who's interested in genealogy or just general Southern history, because it's one of the most remarkable wills we have ever seen. Because if anybody knows anything about Galphin, which is relatively little, it's that they've heard of this will, because it's 10 pages in length, and it goes through blow by blow just all these various individuals' names, which if you look on the surface of it, none of these peoples have the same Galphin name. But if you piece together all the evidence I accumulated from in North America and Ireland and the West Indies, what actually happened is that many of these individuals are actually family members, or they're connected in business with him, or they're, in this case, enslaved. As in terms of the women themselves that he had these very violent sexual relationships with, the only voice that they have is in that, unfortunately, that will and the several codicils that he issued to it. But of the children, they were talked about by other people in the South, who were remarkably sort of astounded that these people of African descent or mixed descent in this case could be so what they call polished and refined. And I also found this brief excerpt of a letter, that the very last letter that Galphin sent to a family member in 1780 was to his African Irish daughter, Barbary. And of all the children and all the correspondence he sent to his children, be it the Muscogee children, the African children, or the English, French children that he also had, Barbary seemed to be his favorite, which is why he, when he manumitted her, he also gave her the most in terms of the enslaved children of their dowry and the various things that they would inherit upon his death. But also that letter, just even calling her my dear Barbary, because Galphin was such a formal person, he never referred to any of his family members or employees by sort of like an endearing name like Barbary, when her actual name is Barbara. So you could get a sense of a profound love for that individual, but at the same time it doesn't take away from the violence of the relationship from which that woman, or that Barbary, was born from.
Exactly. No, it's a very complex relationship to try to even understand and unwind. I think that you framing it within this context of empire is a great way to try to understand that he is seeing himself as a part of this larger network that is in and of itself oppressive and patriarchal and paternalistic. And so it's the way that that's working in that larger empire is also working on his personal and interpersonal level with the people he is surrounded by. And I think that's a great kind of context to pull through it. Something else that because you mentioned briefly, of course, the American Revolution at one point. I have to know, what side did Galphin go for?
So he was a revolutionary. But as I make the case in my book, I call him a reluctant revolutionary, because if there should have been anybody who should have sided against the revolution, it probably should have been Galphin, because of all of his business interests in London. His family's wealth was all invested in London, and all the debts that he could call in were in London. So he took a large gamble for his family when he sided with the Americans. But he also saw it as his personal mission to try to keep the South out of the war, to basically keep Muscogee peoples and those family members out of the Revolutionary War. He wanted to maintain that it was simply that family quarrel between the colonies and the British monarchy. And so he hoped that his family could sort of ride the waves through that. Obviously, that didn't happen, and everything exploded. But Galphin, took the leap, and then he was appointed by the Continental Congress as the Commissioner for Indian Affairs in the South, or Superintendent for Indian Affairs in the South, to try to keep the peace down there. That didn't happen.
Well, and of course, in the American Revolution, even within the Muscogee world, it gets divided between those who are with the British and those who are with the Americans. Was there any divide in his family? Was there a moment of kind of discord in the intimate empire?
Yes. One of the Pooler cousins, Quentin Pooler, who migrated from Ulster over to be in business with Galphin, he was sort of like a merchant contact for Galphin, was a vehement revolutionary. He was a son of liberty, just all out there, tarring and feathering people like crazy, which kind of pissed off Galphin just a little bit.
Yeah.
But then there was also Timothy Bernard and David Holmes, who were both family members from Ireland as well, who sided with the British. And they actually enlisted with John Stuart, the British superintendent for Indian Affairs, and actually tried to thwart Galphin's peace efforts throughout the South. So it tore his family apart like the revolution tore every family apart.
And so that's kind of, and this is, he, if I remember correctly, he dies before the end of the revolution.
Mm-hmm.
And so this is kind of this moment, where his empire that he's been spending so long to build is sort of kind of crumbling, much like the empire that he was working for. So there's this parallel between his life and the empire's life of it's breaking apart at the very end there. But he doesn't have a chance really for a resolution, kind of post-revolution.
Yeah.
But his family, obviously, still, most of them stay in the area and are still kind of active after, correct?
Yes, many of them. And it's been wild and great to be in contact with some of the descendants of the Galphin family today and to hear their stories. And they're all over the United States, which is awesome. But it was, I mean, like your analogy to like the crumbling of the British Empire being the crumbling of Galphin's intimate empire is spot on, because that whole last will and testament I mentioned, that 10-page document that would give up this huge veritable wealth to Galphin, was basically dispossessed by the Georgia government after the war. There was questions to his loyalty, which still has been raising doubts. I'm like, there's no question about his loyalty, where he stood. But at the same time, none of these family members basically get much of the estate that Galphin left behind for them. And so like this veritable wealth just poof, ups and vanishes, on top of all those creditors in London suing the Galphin family repeatedly to try to get their money back from them.
Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Well, kind of, I guess, one way to end, because thank you again for this amazing presentation, but to kind of round out, if there's one thing that you would want to say about how Galphin, he maybe helped define what life was like in the Native South, what's one kind of thing that you'd like people to know about how he helped kind of shape the Native South, what would it be?
Another great question, Alex. The one thing I would like to take away would be, and I sort of privilege this in my teaching as well, is that whenever we talk about Indigenous history, right, it's always about violence. And it's oftentimes we start with Columbus or we start with Jamestown, and then we'll jump around within there. Maybe we'll get to King Philip's War, like, a couple hundred years later, but then oftentimes we just jump to the American Revolution or Indian removal in the Plains Wars of the 19th century. Well, what we're ignoring there is the intimacy, the collaboration, the conflict, but also the compromise that existed between Indigenous and Euro-American worlds over the course of almost 350 years. And the Galphin world is a part of those negotiations. And he spends, 57 years of his life being a part of those negotiations and that intimacy between those two worlds. 350 years is longer than the existence of the United States by a lot. Yet we don't talk about that in the history. That history just gets written out of our textbooks. It gets not just forgotten, but erased. And some people, and I would be one of them, they get erased on purpose, right? Because that 350-year history of collaboration and intimacy sort of defies the narratives that we have about this period and has, the narratives that we have about the United States itself. It's troubling. It troubles the nationalistic narrative that we have about the United States. And I'm hoping that this, if there's one thing that people could take away from that, is that Galphin and his family embodies these, intercultural negotiations and intimacy.
Definitely. That all of our history here in the United States has to begin with Native American history and has to begin understanding that, because the rest of it doesn't make sense without it.
Yeah.
Excellent. Well, thank you so much for joining us. This was, again, like I said, a fabulous presentation, and I learned so much, and I'm sure all of our audience did too. And again, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in our Facebook comments or email me, and we will get you in contact with Dr. Rindfleisch to answer any of your questions. I hope to see you all back again next month for our next Food for Thought lecture. Have a great day.
Bye, everybody.